All right, guys. So now let's talk about strength training. We're going to talk about specifically evidence-based recommendations surrounding volume, intensity, frequency, types of exercises, etc. Again, this is based on a lot of evidence. So I've compiled and reviewed a lot of studies to pull together some recommendations here. A lot of these studies are going to come to different conclusions. So what we're doing is we're using a lot of meta-analysis studies as well as using some smaller studies to elucidate some points that we're trying to make. But overall, this should give you a lot of information about what the overall body of literature is saying and help you guide your strength training programming. All right, so to start off on the topic of volume, the overall goal of strength training with volume is to keep it moderate and to keep the intensity very high. So we're trying to overload tissues here. We're not trying to overload just with the volume. We're really trying to overload with a very high strength stimulus. So we're focusing on the mechanical overload aspect of tissue overload. We want generally to be at 80 to 85% of 1 rep max for optimal strength gains. Again, that window is going to be bigger, but optimal, based on a lot of evidence, is probably around that 80 to 85% for most people in most cases. Overall, programming for strength should be relatively simple. Our overall goal, again, is to overload the tissue. We want to have volume and time allocated to our main compound lifts, again, if the goal is strength. We can have accessory movements, but we're really unable to load accessory movements and single joint movements for a true strength stimulus. So if you think about the leg extension or the hamstring curl or some single joint exercise like that, most of the time we can't load heavy enough safely without a lot of joint stress at like 85% of 1 rep max. Really, you're doing these accessories as accessories. They can actually support a moderate volume of training because you can add these with 8, 10, 12 reps at the end of a strength training session that may have, for the compound lifts, been more focused on 4, 6, 8 type rep range. So overall, our goal is to overload the tissues with progressive overload. We're going to talk about exactly how we do this. And we strategically want to make sure that we're manipulating our training volume to manage fatigue and allow for a really high CNS stimulus of strength. We don't want to be training in this high volume fatigue state. We'd rather want to be training with moderate volume and make it recoverable so we can actually train with high intensity. All right, so how much volume? And this chart from the hypertrophy section is pretty good for the strength section as well because the volume of each set will be lower. Meaning that when we talked about this for hypertrophy, we were talking about sets with at least 8 reps, but a lot of those sets would be sets of 10, sets of 12, sets of 14 reps. Here we're talking about strength. So we're going to be programming sets of 4, sets of 5, sets of 6. That's about half the amount of volume as a set of 12 or 14, for example. So even though the set volume is about half, the number of sets per week that we can recover from is similar to hypertrophy training. So our hypertrophy training, we should see around that 10 to 20 sets per week for most people for this growth range. For strength, it's going to be similar, but that might be 5 sets of 5 and then 4 sets of 6 and then 2 sets of 3 to 4 throughout the week. And again, we'll talk about how we actually design these programs, but that's what that 10, 12 sets might look like per week for strength. We may generally want to be a little bit lower, so maybe we're on the lower end of this for the strength. But again, when we think about it in terms of sets, there's less volume per set, so this generally works out pretty well for both hypertrophy and strength. So the reason that we see these drawbacks with high volume training, and this drawback section is especially true with strength training, the reason for that is that with high volume training, we're going to be sacrificing intensity. If we're doing 20 sets, 30 sets per week, we're not going to be able to train each set with a very high intensity. And we see this play out in the research as well. In high performance sports, high repetition strength with greater than 15 reps should be avoided because it does not provide an adequate training stimulus for gains in muscle cross-sectional area and strength performance. Again, there's a time and a place for higher volume training, but what this research is showing is that we're not getting good outcomes on strength, and we're not necessarily improving cross-sectional area a lot if we're doing greater than 15 reps per set. This study also showed us that high-volume circuit training performed over 2 years negatively impacted the development of power output and max strength of the upper extremities in professional rugby players. This basically just means that we can't overdo our high-volume training, and there are actually a lot of coaches and athletes that are overdoing their high-volume training. For the purpose of hypertrophy, we can strategically build for that, but if we're also trying to optimize the variables of power output and strength, high-volume training is not necessarily going to do that very well for us, especially long-term. We need these blocks of low-volume training with higher intensity. So bringing this back to the force velocity curve here, on the very top end, we have our 1 rep max, 3 rep max, maximal strength type work. And this is really what we're talking about programming right now. On the very bottom of this, we have speed type work, and that's where we're talking about power and speed training. Sometimes our program design for strength kind of blends down this curve, meaning that we might have a strength block or even a hypertrophy block followed by a strength block, followed by a strength/power block, where we start to get into this range, and then followed by a power block, followed by our competition or our training season. And again, we're going to talk about this more when we get into macro cycle planning and how we stack blocks upon each other. But just know that when we're programming, we can program a pure strength block, or we can program a strength/power block. But if we're working up here, we're typically programming with heavy loads, maybe even greater than 85% of 1 rep max if we're way up here at the max strength zone, and then typically less than 6 reps and programming near rep max, meaning low bar speeds, heavy loads if we're trying to maximize this adaptation. As we get into blended programming, that's where you see that 80%, 75% start to creep in, and maybe some sets of 6, some sets of 8, as we're getting into this blended zone. And you might be wondering, why do we actually need to lift heavy loads for strength? A lot of the hypertrophy evidence was suggesting that we needed heavy loads, but fairly recently we actually realized that if we are taking our reps to failure, it comes at a higher metabolic cost and a higher cost of recovery, but we can get good hypertrophy with 50% 1 rep max even. That's not the same for strength. For strength, we actually do need to be loading pretty heavy. The benefits of using heavy load for strength are very well established in the literature, and we have not seen good outcomes for improving 1 rep max with 50%, 60% 1 rep max type loads. While hypertrophy can be achieved across a larger spectrum of loading range, to improve 1 rep max, we typically see that we really do have to load pretty heavy, typically greater than 80% 1 rep max. And even the hypertrophy aspect of this is still largely debated, and some people will still argue that you do need load to improve muscle hypertrophy optimally. All right, so to bring this back to big picture, and again, what we're trying to do here is look at a bunch of evidence that's all coming to slightly different conclusions and draw some takeaways. So for strength training, we want to focus on intensity over volume. Most of our athletes or our clients, if you're doing online training for the average client who's doing 5 to 6 sets of bench press, 5 sets of incline press, chest flies, high volume accessory work, that type of client doing that type of training protocol will probably plateau and never really peak strength, because this program is just all volume and they're probably not hitting enough intensity. Worse yet, they could be doing both. They could be trying to hit RPE 9, RPE 10, taking a lot of these sets to failure, doing a bunch of drop sets to failure, and doing high volume training. And they're really just digging themselves into a hole where they're never getting a good strength stimulus. As someone who's familiar with good training principles, you can actually help them improve this program and write them a better program and help show them better results. There's going to be a lot of people that have plateaued in a lift for years, and just performing a good strength block with lower volume and higher intensity will actually help them really set them on a course to better training results for the next few months. So overall, when the adaptations to high volume plateau and fatigue management becomes the limiting factor, it's time for a lower volume block of training. And this works for athletes as well. A strength stimulus of greater than 80% of 1 rep max is recommended to improve max strength during the off season and in season in American football. Again, this is for the outcome of strength. So someone who's limited in strength might do this, whereas someone who, for example, needs to put on lean body mass or size may benefit from more blocks of hypertrophy training. But if the goal is strength, we know that this is the appropriate stimulus. It's also the appropriate stimulus to reach peak performance in max strength and vertical jump power during a tapering block for track and field athletes. So we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about tapering in a little while, but when we're tapering, we actually generally want a strength stimulus because we're tapering our volume to manage fatigue, and we want a high intensity strength stimulus to still elicit these sport specific adaptations and maximize our strength. So strength stimulus greater than 80% 1 rep max is really great in a power block of training. And also for advanced athletes, we often need a greater than 80% 1 rep max stimulus to produce meaningful hypertrophy and strength improvements. So overall, I hope what you're getting out of this is that there are a lot of cases where a strength block is applicable. And whenever I'm saying strength block, just to clarify here, guys, strength block means that we're doing, it could be 4 weeks, it could be 6 weeks, but a block of training that's focused on the stimulus of improving 1 rep max. That may not necessarily be the primary goal of the athlete. If they're a bodybuilder, for example, their primary goal is obviously hypertrophy, but having a strength block can help them build strength. And then the next block of training, they could build hypertrophy. And if we're just doing hypertrophy, we're going to hit a plateau. Working in these strength blocks changes that stimulus and allows them to adapt differently whenever they go back to a block that is their primary adaptation. So it's important to consider that most athletes will have strength blocks of training throughout their year. Most clients, even if their goal is just general weight loss or general fitness, may still have a good reason for doing strength blocks at least a few times throughout the year. All right, so during these strength blocks, what frequency should we target? And for muscle protein synthesis response, and that's muscle growth, that's really well correlated with increases in strength in 1 rep max. To optimize that, we probably don't want to go much beyond 5 sets per muscle group per day. Again, this is based on the literature, and you guys can review these studies if you want, but most studies show a diminishing return after around 5 sets per muscle group per day. If you're thinking, okay, well, I'm used to training 10 sets or 12 sets or 15 sets of chest every Monday, there's a pretty good chance that you're not actually recovering optimally from that, because those sets are not actually very intense. If you allowed for increased rest, really increase the load, and then maximize your intent and your bar speed and your work in each of your sets, you'd probably find out that 5 to 6 sets per muscle group is probably more optimal than doing 15 sets per muscle group per session. Also, when we're doing 15 sets per session, our 10th, 12th, 14th set is not very effective. What we know is from the literature that it's more beneficial to spread your volume out between 2 to 4 sessions per week. So that's where you're probably going to get your best result, is to do 5 sets per muscle group, but then spread it out to 3 sessions per week. That would be 15 sets per week. And thinking back to our chart, that puts us right in the middle of that growth range. And it's also important to consider that high frequency training is very beneficial for muscular synchronization and motor learning, meaning that if you're trying to improve a specific motor pattern or a lift, then it's actually more beneficial to do more frequent training than to do a ton of training in one session with low frequency. We know that motor learning is just repetition. So a good way to do this would be adding more warm-up sets to practice the movement, but at a low intensity, rather than trying to do RPE 8, 9, and 10 for 6 or 8 sets. It's just not very effective for example, the squat or the bench press. Whereas if you can do effective warm-ups and really execute the movement well, so instead of doing, for example, 6 working sets and you just get under the bar, you add your weight and you just start going at it with really high RPE, that's probably not going to be effective. Whereas if you do 3, 4 good warm-up sets and then you have your 3 or 4 main work sets that are very intense and very focused, you're probably going to get more benefit from that from a 1 rep max and strength gain perspective than you would from a bunch of junk volume. One important note here is that very well-trained lifters can induce a very taxing neural stimulus, meaning they can train very, very intensely, and they may only need, for example, 2 sessions per week. Beginners will benefit from greater frequency, maybe on the high end of this, like 4 sessions per week, spreading that volume out. But our very well-trained lifters may actually benefit from 2 sessions per week, maybe one that's very focused on max strength, and then one that's focused on more of like a dynamic effort. So that might look like a few sets, 3, 4 sets at 1 to 4 rep max type loads on Monday, and then a Thursday training session for the same movement pattern. So squat on Monday, squat on Thursday, but on Thursday doing 5 or 6 sets with a little bit lower load, but higher bar speed. And that 2 times per week frequency has actually been shown to be a pretty good stimulus for our well-trained lifters who can create a very strong neural stimulus and need that longer recovery period. And then going along with that, they may actually only do a barbell back squat 1 time a week, and then dynamic effort lift with the secondary session, maybe a box squat or a front squat or some variation, or a leg press even, but to facilitate recovery. And the goal here is to just really, really optimize that 1 squat session and make it very intense and make sure that they can actually get to that full neural stimulus, that full intensity. For a beginner who doesn't have a good movement awareness, who doesn't have great form, who hasn't been training for a long time, this 1 time, 2 times a week thing is probably not going to be optimal. And if you're programming for advanced lifters, you may actually see a benefit to higher frequency training, but with movement variability and stimulus variability. So for example, you might write a block of training which has max effort days with box squats and Zercher squats, and then dynamic effort days working between belt squats and wide stance high bar squat. And again, this could be, you could think of it as Monday, Thursday, or you can even think of it as Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but strategically working in these variations so that there's movement variability and that we're taxing a different stimulus so that way that these athletes can still come in and put in high effort for each set. If this is the case, we're typically maintaining the variations for 3 to 4 weeks. So we're not just doing random exercises each week. We're strategically picking a variety of exercises and a variety of stimulus, working it for a training block, and then going on to the next training block. There's a good amount of evidence that suggests that varying exercises within a training block does not lead to increased strength gain. There's basically no evidence for muscle confusion, and whenever they're doing these studies with one group having a consistent protocol and another group doing a protocol that's changing the exercise throughout the training block, we don't see improved or increased strength gains with muscle confusion. There's just no evidence for that. And if anything, they're actually typically responding a little bit less than the group that's consistently loading the same or similar movement patterns. So just one more time to clarify, when we're doing this higher frequency training with movement variability, we're still typically picking a few exercises and progressively overloading them week to week. It's just that we might have, for example, 4 squat variations, but we're still hitting those same 4 squat variations week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4 in most cases. All right, so now talking about types of exercises that we can pick, and you saw some examples up there, but most of these lifts are going to be compound lifts because our accessory lifts and our single joint movements are very difficult to load to the extent required for a strength stimulus. Again, we can still include them in the program, but they're as accessories and they're just supporting the overall main goal of the compound lifts. The amount of accessory movements that you choose will depend on what you're trying to accomplish with the next block of training, and we may also use accessory movements to build towards a block of sport-specific training. All right, so let's look at some evidence around youth athletes, and this is a systematic review and meta-analysis. So again, this is pulling a lot of information in and giving us some conclusions. So there is moderate effect on muscle strength and vertical jump performance from resistance training, and a small effect on linear sprint, agility, and sport-specific performance. When it comes to youth athletes, so this could be our 10-year-olds, our 14-year-olds, our 16-year-olds, strength training does tend to have a dose-response relationship, meaning that if we are improving our strength, we will see moderate improvements as well to performance. It's most effective in improving muscular strength. Again, strength training for improving the outcome of strength. We see that the protocols that tend to be most effective are training periods of greater than 23 weeks, about 5 sets per exercise with 6 to 8 reps per set. We don't typically see our youth athletes benefiting from really low repetition volume. So 6 to 8 probably seems more optimal than, for example, sets of 2, sets of 4, especially for our youth athletes as they're trying to still build their technique. They need that higher repetition. But we still want high intensity. We still want that 80 to 89% of 1 rep max for our sets of 6, for our sets of 8. Importantly, for strength in general and for strength for our youth athletes, we are not rushing our rest. We want to keep a good, adequate rest period of 3 to 4 minutes between sets. And this is a good time to coach and provide feedback and practice the movement. So compared to high volume training with sets of 15 and 20, we want to primarily implement resistance training programs with fewer reps and higher intensity. So again, in that 6 to 8 rep range, 80%-ish 1 rep max, and that will help us improve physical performance measures in our youth athletes. And again, this is safe. There's a ton of evidence showing that this is safe. When it comes to older adults, we also see a dose-response relationship in resistance training. Our older adults performing resistance training will show improved muscle size, a larger effect in 1 rep max of both 1 rep max upper extremity and lower extremity movements, and a medium effect in maximum voluntary contraction of the lower extremities. So this is just saying that we see good results from resistance training in our older adults. Techniques to specifically improve muscle strength in our older adults, longer training periods of 50 to 53 weeks, so basically a year. They need that consistency. We want to see intensities of 70 to 79% 1 rep max. We're typically not going to see as much benefit from those very high loads, and one of the reasons is that very high loads do have an effect on blood pressure. There are some older adults that can definitely handle it, and that's fine, but what this is showing us is that we're seeing better results from a little bit lower loads, 70 to 79% 1 rep max, still pretty heavy, but without quite the tax on blood pressure that we would see with very heavy loads. We also see a benefit to slowing reps down for our older adults. A time under tension of around 6 seconds with a 4-second rest between reps is actually probably optimal for our older adults. Also, about 60 seconds rest between sets seems to be optimal. And I would actually even say that we can extend that to 2 minutes, and that's totally appropriate for our older adults. We want to see a frequency of around 2 sessions per week and a volume of 2 to 3 sets per exercise with 7 to 9 reps per set. So overall takeaways for our older adults, we still want to program heavy and hard for strength with 70 to 79% 1 rep max. This could be 3 sets of 7. This could be 2 sets of 8. This could be 2 sets of 10. If we're around this range and we're programming consistently 2 times per week with good slow movement, controlled heavy loads, we're going to see good results for our older adults. When it comes to periodization, and again, we're going to talk about this more when we're talking about putting blocks together, but I want to give you guys some information on this now and start to get you to see how this works. Greg Nuckols did a great article review on this that showed that across many studies, the average strength gain with a daily undulating periodization protocol was around 26%. The average strength gain with a linear periodization protocol was around 21%. So we see similar results between the two, and a lot of studies have actually showed maybe a little bit better results from daily undulating periodization. And we're going to talk about what that means here. So a linear periodization program over 30 weeks, so we're talking about over 6 months here, it may look like this. For the first 10 sessions, we have 3 times a week where we're training consistently around 60% 1 rep max. What you're going to see here is a bunch of sets to failure, and this is fairly common in research, even though we know that training to failure for 5 sets is generally not a good idea, but it's done for consistency and other purposes in the literature. But what we may see is 5 sets at 60% 1 rep max for about 10 weeks. The next 10 weeks, we move down to 4 sets at 75% 1 rep max, and then we go down to 3 sets. So our volume, we're going from 5 to 4 to 3. Our volume is decreasing, and our intensity going from 60 to 75 to 90% is increasing. So frequency stayed the same, volume decreasing, intensity increasing. And this is just a very basic example of how linear periodization works with our training blocks. So another way to put this is that this is like a volume block or a hypertrophy block because we're around that 60% 1 rep max. We're doing higher volume, 5 sets. This would be more of like a strength-ish block. And then this would be more of like a strength/power block where we're very heavy loaded. So that would be our traditional linear periodization going from like hypertrophy to strength/power. And this may lead us to a competition. All right, by contrast, let's look at our daily undulating periodization program. The work that we're doing and the sets and reps are actually the same. 5 sets to failure at 60%, 4 sets at 75%, 3 sets at 90%. The only difference here is that for daily undulating periodization, we're doing this Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So we're training all 3 at the same time. So at the same time, we're training, for example, a hypertrophy day Monday, a strength day Wednesday, and a strength/power day on Friday, meaning that we're not focused on one thing for 10 weeks and then focused on a different thing for 10 weeks, we're training 3 different qualities within 1 week. And that's how our daily undulating periodization works at a basic level. The pros and cons here, the pros of the linear periodization model is that we're kind of building up to a very specific peak. So over here, we're not optimizing for hypertrophy, but we're optimizing for the adaptations of 1 rep max and training very close to that. Whereas here in the daily undulating periodization programming protocol, we're training for multiple things at once. So we're not really ever optimizing one variable, but we are maintaining a lot of variables. And there actually is pretty good evidence for this improving 1 rep max, maybe even more than the linear periodization protocol. And we'll get back to this and see different examples later. Some other considerations with strength training is that we generally see better results with longer rest periods. Going back to the start, we were trying to focus on mechanical overload. So decreasing our rest and focusing on metabolic stress tends to not be very effective for the outcome of strength. We want long rest and we want to be recovering well. Overall, periodized resistance training programs tend to do better than non-periodized resistance training programs, especially for the outcome of 1 rep max. So what this means is that if we're actually manipulating our volume and our intensity over time, then we're going to see better results than having no change in our stimulus or having a random change in our stimulus. Another thing to consider with strength programming is wave loading, and this is fairly common. You may have seen the program 5-3-1, for example, but a wave loading protocol is when we're doing, instead of 3 sets of 4, we're doing a set of 5, a set of 4, a set of 3, a set of 4, 3, 2, or 8-6-4, 6-4-2. There's not a lot of evidence on this due to lack of studies. It may provide a novel stimulus, so it may be a good protocol for at least a short period of time, but over time, it likely produces similar gains to performing straight sets. There are, of course, some systems that swear by wave protocols and wave loading, and there are some systems that think it doesn't work at all. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, that it may be beneficial. And not to be confused with wave loading was still staying within a similar rep range. So instead of 3 sets of 6, doing 8-6-4, that was still pretty close to 6. We could also do varied loading ranges where we have vastly different loading ranges. For example, 2-4 for 1 time a week, 8-12 for 1 time a week, and then 20-30 1 time a week. Overall, we can compare this to, for example, staying between 8-12 reps every session for 3 times per week. So this is similar to what you would see with daily undulating periodization, where we're having 1 low rep day, 1 moderate rep day, and 1 high rep day. And at least in this study, and this is a pretty good study, it did not show any differences in strength, endurance, or hypertrophy to do this varied loading protocol compared to this typical hypertrophy rep range protocol. All right, so I don't want you guys to get lost in these individual studies. I do want to present you with a lot of information so that you have the choices and can look back on this when you're writing your programs, but I want to keep the big picture in mind as well. So let's compare now a strength athlete and a bodybuilder. A strength athlete is someone like a powerlifter who's really focused on consistently providing intensity and neuromuscular strength adaptations to improve 1 rep max. So for this athlete, like we've talked about, high volume training sessions can actually reduce the intensity achievable in subsequent training sessions. So it's not beneficial for our strength athlete to go in and crush it on Monday with a lot of volume, because their Wednesday session, they won't be able to hit very high loads. A little bit different is our priorities of our bodybuilder, who's trying to consistently train and recover from a higher volume of training and really optimize the stimulus of muscle protein synthesis. So there are going to be different priorities between these two athletes, and they're going to need different amounts of volume training versus strength training. So over the course of a year, we might see that a bodybuilder programs 10 volume blocks per year. So if you're programming for a bodybuilder, you may go to the hypertrophy section of this course and write out a good block of training that's hypertrophy focused, and you may plug that type of block in 10 times per year. Whereas a powerlifter may only use that hypertrophy block of training 5 or maybe 8 times per year. They, as a powerlifter, may program in many more strength blocks. So the program block that you write for this section, which has higher loads and lower volume, may fit more times per year for a powerlifter. At different phases throughout the year, a powerlifter and a bodybuilder's training may look very similar, but it may be the off season for the powerlifter and the in season for the bodybuilder that looks similar, where they're both doing a hypertrophy block. Or it may be the case that when our powerlifter is getting close to competition and practicing strength-based movements, our bodybuilder is off season and building a base of strength, and that type of training would look similar. So this is a really important concept to understand, that both powerlifters and bodybuilders can have volume blocks and intensity blocks. It's just the ratio of each and what they specifically look like will differ. So let's look at this on a graph here. And this is a typical linear periodization example here from Greg Nuckols again. What we see here is that we're trying to decrease our volume over the course of 16 weeks, and we're trying to increase our intensity. So this is fairly linear. We have a block that's flat and then we have an increase, but this is generally what we see with those graphs where our intensity is going up and our volume is going down. Within this graph, we can block off a chunk of training and call this a strength block, whereas we can block off a chunk over here and call this a volume block of training. So when we're talking about periodization, it's not this super confusing concept. We just have a volume block of training, an intermediate block of training, and then a strength block of training. And that's what leads us to our competition. And if we're doing 4-week blocks, it might be 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks. If we're doing 6-week blocks, it might be 1, 2, 3 blocks. But either way, we're structuring these blocks next to each other in such a way that it promotes this overall trend that we're looking for. All right, so here's where it gets exciting. We can actually do undulation within a linear model. And at the start of this course, this would probably be super confusing, but hopefully you guys have a little bit of an understanding of this and how this would work now. So again, we can just think of this as a volume block. Maybe this is 4 weeks right here that we're focused on volume. So looking at this first 4 weeks, we can consider this a volume block. And even though this is a volume block where our volume is generally high and our intensity is generally low, we may see some variability within the week. So what we may see here is that on Monday, we're working 4 sets of 15, whereas on Friday, we're working 5 sets of 8. And then we have some variability within the week, but it's staying within the goals of a higher volume program. And generally, we may have some fluctuation in our intensity from 60% to 70% to 72%, but we're staying within our general goal of intensity. And that would be for our volume block, and we would see something similar here. And then for our strength block, we would see the opposite. So maybe we're working now at very high intensities at 80%, 85%, 90%. So 80% Monday here, 85% Wednesday, 90% on Friday. So we're staying within a general high intensity framework, but there's some variability within the week. And we could build these blocks strategically with that within week variability, but still following this overall trend leading us to a competition. And this will continue to make more sense as we see more examples. So thinking back to what is a volume block, that's what we talked about with hypertrophy. It's higher volume. It's typically used in the off season or maybe early preseason. It's programmed to increase the volume lifted so that we have exposure to a high training load and provide athletes the ability to optimize performance and reduce injury risk during their lower training volumes in sport-specific blocks. So by strategically programming these high volume blocks in the off season when we're not doing a lot of sport training, we're accommodating the athlete to a higher volume of training so that they can handle the demands of, for example, sport training or competition specific training that they're going to get into as they approach their competition. Adaptations to that volume block include hypertrophy, motor learning, technique improvement. Although this technique improvement, we're going to talk about a little bit more with our intensification/strength block, which we'll get to in a second. But more adaptations to volume blocks are general strength, joint stability, hypertrophy, that kind of thing. We do want to emphasize that movement variability is good for long-term development. If we're training just the pecs in a very specific way for our powerlifter, we don't want to do that year-round, even though it will help them improve their bench optimally. Year-round, we want to make sure we're also including accessory work and working different portions of the shoulder so that way we're not leading to overuse injuries and muscle imbalances. By programming these higher volume blocks with more movement variability, we can provide the athlete with good joint stability, good general strength, good hypertrophy around the shoulder, and overall keep them safe for year-round training. Some methods that might be included in the volume block, which we were talking about more with hypertrophy, is supersets, drop sets, pyramids, maybe even wave loading, but in the higher repetition zones. And these are all techniques that allow us to get to higher volumes of training. A volume block that's still within the context of strength training may look like this. We're at that 10-8-6, 8-6-4, 7-5-4 type rep range. This is generally a little bit low for hypertrophy work and a little bit high for strength work. So this may work for a volume block with the goal of strength. We could also do a hypertrophy block with 3 sets of 15 and 4 sets of 10 and even higher reps in this. But this may be like a block that blends us. So to fit the overall trend of linear periodization, for example, we may have a hypertrophy block followed by a volume strength block, followed by a traditional strength block, followed by a low volume competition specific strength block to follow those overall trends and lead us towards our competition. So that's what a volume block with the strength focus looks like. What about a strength block? And now let's talk about that. So strength blocks are typically used in the late preseason or in season for our athletes as they're doing more sport training and they're approaching their season. We're typically programming these to decrease volume and increase our intensity. A very basic example of this might be 3 to 5 sets of 4 to 6 reps of squats, push, pull, lunge. And we may even be on the low end of this, 2-3 sets as we get closer to season and more sport training. This may also come with less accessory work. So we may hit just these basics of a squat, push, pull, lunge with maybe even just 4 exercises per training session, whereas a volume block might have 6, 7, 8 exercises per session. Some adaptations that we see with a strength training block are obviously strength, but also neuromuscular efficiency and technique improvement, especially with the competition lifts or what you're training. So especially for our athletes who are competing in the squat, the bench, the deadlift, they're going to see improvements in their technique by training these specific lifts in a competition-like scenario with, for example, pin press to improve bench press, or competition practice squats where you're actually pausing at the bottom and trying to perform as if you're in a competition. We're going to see those technique improvements. All right, when we're trying to specifically peak, we want to maximize speed strength in the short term by using strength/power training and at least by this study, around twice per week. So if we're peaking, there's a lot that goes into this. We're typically decreasing our volume by 40 to 60%. So our volume is going way down, and we're emphasizing or maximizing the adaptations of strength and power. So our intensity is staying the same or maybe even creeping up a little bit, and our frequency is probably staying about the same, maybe decreasing a little bit, but our volume is really where we're cutting. An important takeaway from the study is that a single strength training power session with the method of max explosive strength, so we're talking about 90% 1 rep max, very high loads, this would be recommended 1 to 2 days before competition because of the short regeneration times and the potentiation effects. This means that our athletes need to be lifting heavy before competition. It's very tempting to say, okay, just take it light because you have a competition in a day or two, but we need to be programming heavy for these athletes. And that might lead you to the question, well, what about programming light but moving very fast? And this study also analyzed that protocol with a 30% 1 rep max with very fast speeds. And although this method can work, and maybe we program 1 or 2 exercises like this, like a med ball throw or a loaded jump, it didn't show statistically superior gains. And you may be wondering now, okay, well, what about low loaded exercises like 30% 1 rep max performed very fast? And this study actually did analyze that protocol. But this protocol with ballistic strength training, when compared to the heavier protocol, did not perform better results. So what this is saying is that compared with the ballistic strength training protocol with low rep max, the other protocol, the heavy reps, provided statistically superior gains in max strength, peak power, impulse size, and explosive strength during the tapering phase for track and field throwers. So my takeaway from this and what I want you guys to get out of this is that we want to be programming at least a few exercises with that very heavy load, even within our season and a few days before competition. We may also program 1 or 2 exercises like a med ball throw or a jump with 30% 1 rep max, but overall our program should be pretty heavy. We might see, for example, just to lay out the basics of a program here within the peaking phase, we may see 1 or 2 main movements like a trap bar deadlift, very heavy, or a back squat, maybe a bench press that's very heavy but low volume, followed by a few exercises like throwing and jumping, and then maybe 1 or 2 accessories. All right, now here's the exciting part where we get to actually apply this information and think about scenarios here. So example one of your clients is getting great results from improving his bench press strength. A friend of your client reaches out to you asking for bench press tips since his bench press has plateaued for a while. He has been bench pressing on Monday and Thursday for 5 sets of flat bench, 4 sets of dumbbell incline press for months. He always does 2 to 3 sets to failure and a few drop sets. What type of training block does this friend need? So maybe this friend is reaching out to you because he knows that you train his other friend here, and he wants your advice based on this training protocol that's not doing very well for him. And I actually think this is a realistic situation. So what would you actually recommend in this case for this client? And what I would probably recommend is an intensity block. This client has been chronically overtraining in terms of volume and undertraining in terms of intensity. He's just constantly hitting a bunch of drop sets and a bunch of sets to failure with high volume, but not really loading heavy. So chances are giving him a block of training with 3 sets of 5, 4 sets of 5, 3 sets of 3, 3 sets of 8, and loading heavy for a few weeks will actually get him to improve 1 rep max strength. And then he can go back to higher volume training, maybe not quite what he was doing, but more strategic, and then he would get better results whenever he does get back to that. So in this case, strength and intensity is the low-hanging fruit. Starting with perhaps 2 times per week of a low volume training, accessory work's not shown here. This is just the basics of what that program might look like. What may be most beneficial for him is around 2 times per week with a low volume program. Accessory work could also be included here. It's not in this program, but this is just the basic framework of what that program might look like. But again, takeaway here is that you can provide a strength-based program and provide a different stimulus to what he's had, and this will allow for a different adaptation. All right, example number 2, a young powerlifter has been consistently increasing his 1 rep max for the past year by 5 to 10 pounds per training block using 5-3-1 and a competition prep program that he got from a friend. So all you need to know about this program is that it's low volume, high intensity, a lot of sets of 5, 3, and 1, and he really hasn't been training high volume. This worked out well for a long time for him, but for the past 3 months, his progress has stalled and he is now feeling stiff and weak in his core. So this is the information that he presents to you. What type of training block are you going to program for this client? And in all likelihood, this athlete probably needs a volume block of training. He is probably maxed out on the neuromuscular adaptations and the max strength adaptations associated with the training that he has been doing.